Hello, my name's Eric, and I'm a 42-year-old auto mechanic who's been married to Jessica for 14 years. We live in Cedar Hill, a small but bustling town in Texas where life is about as predictable as the slow turn of the seasons. Jessica and I met in our 20s. She was the girl next door, both literally and figuratively. I was the guy with grease-stained hands working in my dad's auto shop, and she was the college student with big dreams and a smile that could make you forget about the sweltering Texas heat. We started dating, and it felt like magic. Jess had a way of making me feel like the center of her universe, like I was the one who could fix anything, not just busted transmissions. A year later, we got married, standing under a makeshift arch in her parents' backyard. Her father cracked jokes about how a mechanic could never afford his daughter, but the way she looked at me made me think I was richer than any Wall Street tycoon. 14 years later, we had what most people would call a good life. Jessica worked as a real estate agent, and I had taken over the family shop after my dad retired. The shop wasn't a gold mine, but it kept the lights on and put food on the table. We had 2 kids, a boy named Luke, 12, and a girl named Emma, 9. If you asked anyone in town, they'd probably tell you the Ericksons were the picture of a happy family. And for the most part, we were. Or at least I thought we were. It started with the little things, as these stories often do. Jessica began coming home later than usual, claiming she had to meet clients or attend networking events. Her phone became her constant companion, always in her hand or tucked into her purse, and I couldn't help but notice how she angled the screen away when I was around. I brushed it off at first. She was a hard-working woman, and I trusted her. After all, we built a life together. Trust wasn't just part of our marriage. It was its foundation. One evening, she came home with a new energy about her. She was glowing, and I made a joke about her closing a big deal. She laughed, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "You could say that." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, wondering why those words didn't sit right. I'd never been the paranoid type, but something shifted in my gut. Call it intuition, or the kind of sixth sense you develop when you've been with someone for over a decade. Whatever it was, it gnawed at me, a tiny ember of doubt that I couldn't extinguish. I threw myself into work, telling myself I was imagining things. Jessica had always been the social one, the life of the party. Her job required charm and charisma. It wasn't unusual for her to be on her phone constantly or to meet with clients at odd hours. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on. One night, Luke was struggling with his math homework, and I asked Jessica if she could help him. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and barely looked up. "I'm swamped with work, honey. Can you handle it?" she said, her tone flat. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, like she was a million miles away. Luke looked disappointed, but I assured him we'd figure it out together. Later, as I tucked him into bed, he asked me, "Dad, is Mom mad at us?" His question hit me like a sucker punch. I assured him everything was fine, but deep down, I wondered if he saw something I was too blind to admit. By the time fall rolled around, things had only gotten worse. Jessica was increasingly distant, her laughter at my jokes less frequent, her touch more reserved. I started noticing other signs. The new perfume she didn't wear for me, the way her eyes lit up at her phone but dulled when she looked at me. Still, I didn't want to believe it. I convinced myself I was being irrational, that the stress of running the shop and raising kids was making me overthink things. But every now and then, I'd catch her with a look on her face, like she was carrying a secret too big to keep. It wasn't until one Sunday morning, as I sat in the garage tinkering with an old Chevy, that I realized how much I'd been avoiding the truth. Emma ran in, holding Jessica's phone, which she'd left on the counter. "Daddy, Mommy's phone keeps buzzing. Should I give it to her?" she asked. I froze. The phone was practically vibrating in her tiny hand, notifications lighting up the screen. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself saying, "It's okay, sweetheart. I'll take it to her." As Emma skipped off, I glanced down at the screen. It was a message from a name I didn't recognize. All it said was, "Can't wait to see you again tonight." For a moment, I just stared at it, my chest tightening like a vice. My hands were shaking, but I somehow managed to lock the phone and place it on the workbench. Jessica's voice called out from inside the house, asking if I was ready for breakfast. Yeah, I called back, my voice barely above a whisper. I knew then that my world was about to change. When I walked back into the house that Sunday morning, Jessica was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, flipping through her planner like everything was normal. Emma was at the counter, her face smeared with syrup from the pancakes she'd made with Luke. It was a scene I'd seen 100 times before, but now it felt like I was looking at it through glass, removed from the life I thought I knew. Jessica didn't look up when I set her phone down on the counter. Your phone's been going off, I said. My voice was steady, though it felt like I was holding my breath. Oh, thanks, she replied casually, reaching for it. Her eyes darted to the screen for just a second, and I saw the faintest flicker of something. Relief, maybe, or guilt. She slipped the phone into her pocket and turned her attention back to her planner. I sat down across from her, trying to keep my face neutral. Anything interesting going on today? I asked. It was an innocent enough question, one I asked almost every weekend. Just the usual, she said with a shrug. Meeting a new client later this afternoon. Shouldn't take long. She took a sip of her coffee, and for a moment, it seemed like she was daring me to ask more. I didn't. Not yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. We went about our Sunday like any other, grocery shopping, cleaning the house, and prepping for the week ahead. But every time Jessica left the room, I found myself staring at her phone on the counter, wondering if I had the right to look deeper. By the time the afternoon rolled around, my curiosity had turned into a need for answers. Jessica left around 4 p.m., dressed in a way that felt too polished for a casual client meeting. I didn't say anything, just kissed her on the cheek as she walked out the door. Luke and Emma were upstairs, so I grabbed my jacket and keys, and a few minutes later, I was in my truck, following her car at a safe distance. She drove across town, taking turns that didn't make sense for someone headed to a business meeting. My heart sank as she pulled into the parking lot of a small boutique hotel on the edge of town. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I watched as she got out of her car, smoothed her skirt, and walked into the lobby without a second glance. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door she'd just walked through. Part of me wanted to burst in, to demand answers right there and then. But another part of me, maybe the smarter part, knew that wasn't the way to handle this. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it. I needed proof. The private investigator I hired wasn't cheap, but he came highly recommended by one of my regular customers at the shop, a retired cop who'd worked with him on a few cases. His name was Alan, and he had the kind of no-nonsense attitude I appreciated. I met him at a diner the next day, sliding a manila envelope with a retainer fee across the table as I explained my suspicions. Alan didn't say much, just nodded and took notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. I'll get started right away, he said as he stood to leave. Give me a week. That week was the longest of my life. Every time Jessica's phone buzzed, every time she came home late or gave me some vague excuse about work, I felt like I was holding my breath. I tried to act normal for the kids, but I could see the confusion in Luke's eyes, the way Emma asked why I was so quiet all the time. On Friday evening, Alan called and told me he had everything I needed. We met at his office, a small space above a pawn shop downtown. He handed me a thick folder and gave me a long, measured look. You sure you want to see this? He asked. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure at all. Inside the folder were photos, timestamps, and detailed notes. Jessica hadn't been meeting clients or attending networking events. She'd been meeting the same man at that boutique hotel over and over again. Alan had even managed to get a name, David Henderson, a married father of two who worked as a regional manager for a big box store in the next town over. I sat there in Alan's office, staring at the evidence laid out before me, my stomach turning with every page. There were pictures of Jessica laughing with David in the hotel parking lot, her hand on his arm, her head tilted back in a way I hadn't seen in years. There were screenshots of their texts, full of inside jokes and plans to meet again. By the time I closed the folder, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Alan sat across from me, silent, waiting for me to process what I'd just seen. What do I do now? I asked finally. That's up to you, he said. You've got the proof. Whether you confront her, file for divorce, or something else entirely, it's your call. Just know that you've got options. I nodded, though I didn't feel like I had any options at all. When I got home that night, Jessica was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She smiled when she saw me, the same easy, charming smile that had drawn me to her all those years ago. For a moment, I almost believed nothing had changed. But everything had. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon wafting through the house. It was one of Jessica's Saturday rituals. She'd cook a big breakfast for the family, complete with pancakes, eggs, and bacon. Normally, I'd feel a pang of gratitude seeing her in the kitchen, but today, I felt something else entirely. Betrayal sat heavy in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. She looked up when I entered the kitchen, flipping a pancake onto a plate with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. "Morning," she said, her tone cheerful. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself." I nodded and poured myself a cup, watching her move around the kitchen with practiced grace. If she noticed the tension in my shoulders, or the way I avoided her gaze, she didn't mention it. Emma and Luke came bounding downstairs a few minutes later, their laughter filling the room as they argued over who got the first pancake. Jessica played the doting mother perfectly, her smile never faltering, her voice full of warmth. It made me sick. I spent the rest of the weekend avoiding her as much as possible. I took Luke to the park to throw a football around, helped Emma with her science project, and even tackled some overdue maintenance on the house. Jessica didn't seem to notice my absence, or if she did, she didn't say anything. She spent most of her time on her phone or running errands, slipping out for hours at a time with vague explanations about grocery shopping or meeting clients. By Sunday evening, I couldn't take it anymore. The evidence from Alan's investigation sat in a locked drawer in my office, a constant reminder of the truth I was trying to avoid. Every time I looked at Jessica, every time she smiled at me or touched my arm, I felt like I was going to explode. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I decided to dig deeper. If Jessica was capable of lying to me about something as big as this, what else was she hiding? I waited until she went to bed that night, then crept downstairs and retrieved her phone from the kitchen counter. It was risky. Jessica wasn't the kind of person to leave her phone unlocked, but luck was on my side. Her password was still the same. The kids' birth dates. I sat down at the dining room table and scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding with every swipe. Most of them were mundane. Text from her mom, reminders about work meetings, group chats with her friends. But then I found the thread with David Henderson, and everything clicked into place. The messages were explicit, filled with details about their meetings, their plans, their feelings for each other. David was everything Jessica claimed to hate: arrogant, cocky, and dismissive of anyone who didn't fit his worldview. But in her texts, she painted him as some kind of savior, a man who understood her in ways I never could. I wanted to smash the phone against the wall, to wake her up and confront her right then and there. But instead, I took screenshots of everything, emailing them to myself for safekeeping. When I was done, I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and went to bed, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. Over the next few days, I tried to act normal. I went to work, helped the kids with their homework, and even laughed at Jessica's jokes during dinner. But every interaction felt like a performance, a facade I was struggling to maintain. Jessica, for her part, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. On Wednesday evening, she came home late, her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed. She kissed me on the cheek and mumbled something about a long day at work before disappearing upstairs to shower. I followed her, my stomach churning as I watched her undress and step into the bathroom like nothing was wrong. "Jessica," I called out, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. She poked her head out of the bathroom, her expression curious. "Yeah, do you love me?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unavoidable. Her brow furrowed, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Panic, maybe, or guilt. But then she smiled, the same practice smile she used on her clients. "Of course I do. Why would you even ask that?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching her, wondering how much longer I could keep up this charade. By Friday, I'd had enough. I waited until the kids were at school and Jessica was at work before calling Alan. I'm ready to move forward, I told him. He didn't ask what I meant. He already knew. Alan connected me with a divorce lawyer named Rebecca, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being ruthless in court. I met with her that afternoon, laying out everything I had: Jessica's infidelity, the evidence Alan had collected, the screenshots from her phone. Rebecca listened intently, taking notes and asking pointed questions. By the time I left her office, I felt like I'd taken the first step toward regaining control of my life. When Jessica came home that evening, I was sitting at the dining room table, the folder from Alan's investigation in front of me. She paused in the doorway, her eyes flicking to the folder and then to my face. "What's that?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Sit down," I said. She hesitated, but eventually took a seat across from me. I slid the folder across the table, watching her face as she opened it and began flipping through the contents. Her expression went from confusion to shock to something I couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or fear. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You tell me," I said. For the first time in years, Jessica didn't have a clever response. She just stared at me, the cracks in her mask finally showing. Jessica's hand trembled as she clutched the folder, her eyes darting across the pages as if hoping to find some way to deny the undeniable. When she finally looked up at me, her face was pale, and the confidence she always carried seemed to vanish. "Erick, it's not what it looks like," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "You have to believe me." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "It's exactly what it looks like, Jessica, and you don't get to lie to me anymore. Not after this." She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, clearly trying to decide how to spin the situation. I could see the gears turning in her head, but I wasn't going to let her manipulate her way out of this. I'd seen the texts, the pictures, the proof. There was no room for doubt. "Who is he?" I asked, my tone flat. I didn't need the answer. I already knew it was David Henderson, but I wanted to hear it from her. Jessica closed the folder and set it down on the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He's a client," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "We met through work and you decided to start sleeping with him?" I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't insult me by pretending this was innocent." She flinched but didn't deny it. Instead, she looked away, her eyes focused on a spot on the wall. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said finally. "I didn't plan for this, Erick. I swear." "Didn't plan for what, Jessica?" I shot back. "To cheat on your husband? To betray your family? Because that's exactly what you did." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't move me. For years, I'd been the one to comfort her, to forgive her for every slight and misstep. But this wasn't something I could forgive. Not now. Not ever. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking. I ended it. I ended it weeks ago." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's supposed to make me feel better? That you got tired of him before I found out?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "I realized it was a mistake. I didn't want to hurt you, Erick. I didn't want to hurt our family. But you did." My voice was low, but the weight behind my words was unmistakable. "You made that choice, Jessica, over and over again." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Jessica wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "Erick, I love you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I messed up, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us." I stared at her, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. "You don't get to decide that," I said. "You don't get to sit there and act like this is something we can just fix. You didn't just hurt me, Jessica. You destroyed everything we built together." She reached across the table, her hand hovering over mine. "Please, Erick," she said. "Don't throw this away. Don't throw us away." I pulled my hand back, shaking my head. "You're the one who threw us away, Jessica. Not me." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of what she'd done. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "I'll do anything." I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. "I want you to leave." Jessica's eyes widened, and for a moment, She looked like she might argue. But then she nodded, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "I'll go pack a bag," she said, her voice barely audible. As she walked upstairs, I stayed at the table, staring at the folder in front of me. The anger that had been fueling me began to give way to something else. Exhaustion, sadness, a hollow feeling I couldn't quite describe. This was my wife, the woman I'd loved for 14 years, the mother of my children. And now she was just leaving. When she came back down, she was carrying a small suitcase. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, looking at me with tear-streaked cheeks. "What do we tell the kids?" she asked. "We'll figure that out," I said. "But for now, you need to go." She nodded and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "I'm sorry, Eric," she said, her voice cracking. "I really am." I didn't respond. I couldn't. She opened the door and stepped outside, closing it softly behind her. And just like that, she was gone. The house felt impossibly quiet after she left. I sat at the table for a long time, my head in my hands, trying to process everything. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and lock the door, then went to check on Luke and Emma. They were asleep, their faces peaceful in a way that felt almost cruel given what was happening. I stood in the doorway of their room for a long time, wondering how I was going to explain this to them. How do you tell your kids that the life they knew is gone? That their mother betrayed their father? That nothing will ever be the same again? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the road ahead was going to be long and painful, and there was no way to avoid it. The next morning, the house felt cold and empty. I had spent most of the night pacing the living room, my mind replaying the confrontation with Jessica over and over again. It didn't feel real, even though every detail was still vivid in my head. I wanted to believe that I'd wake up and find it was just some nightmare, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When Luke and Emma came downstairs for breakfast, they didn't notice anything was off at first. I had forced myself to put on a calm face, preparing their usual cereal and orange juice as if nothing had changed. But kids are perceptive, and it didn't take long for Luke to pick up on the tension. "Where's Mom?" he asked, glancing around the kitchen. "She had to go out of town for a little while," I said carefully. "She'll be staying with a friend for a bit." "Why?" Emma asked, her big eyes fixed on me. "It's complicated," I replied. "But don't worry. Everything's going to be okay." It wasn't much of an answer, and I could tell they weren't satisfied. But I wasn't ready to explain the truth yet, not without more time to figure out how to handle it. Luke gave me a long, searching look, like he wanted to press the issue, but he ultimately shrugged and went back to eating his cereal. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I spent most of it at the shop, trying to focus on fixing cars instead of the mess my life had become. My employees noticed that I was quieter than usual, but they didn't push. I was grateful for that. The last thing I needed was sympathy or questions I couldn't answer. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat down at the dining room table with a legal pad and a pen. Rebecca had given me a lot to think about during our meeting, and I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. If Jessica wanted to fight me on custody or assets, I needed to be prepared. And if she decided to try to come back and make amends, I needed to be ready for that, too. I started by listing out everything I wanted to protect: the house, the shop, my relationship with the kids. Losing any of those things wasn't an option. I wasn't going to let Jessica's betrayal take away the life I'd worked so hard to build. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls and paperwork. Rebecca worked quickly, drafting separation agreements and gathering documentation for our case. I provided her with copies of the evidence Alan had collected, as well as financial records and a detailed timeline of Jessica's behavior. She assured me that we had a strong case, but her blunt honesty was both comforting and sobering. "This isn't going to be easy," she told me during one of our calls. "Even if she doesn't fight you on custody, the emotional toll is going to be heavy. You need to be ready for that." "I don't have a choice," I said. "I have to protect my kids." Jessica called me 2 days after she left, her number popping up on my phone while I was at the shop. I let it go to voicemail, but the sight of her name made my stomach churn. When I finally worked up the nerve to listen to the message, her voice was quiet and hesitant. "Eric, it's me. I just wanted to see how the kids are doing. I know you're probably still angry, but can we talk? Please?" I need to explain. I didn't call her back. There was nothing she could say that would make what she'd done any less devastating. Instead, I texted her a brief update about Luke and Emma, making it clear that any future communication would be about the kids and nothing else. She responded almost immediately, thanking me and asking if we could meet to discuss the situation. I ignored her. Rebecca filed the separation agreement later that week, and I felt a small sense of relief knowing that the process was officially underway. But the relief was short-lived. Jessica showed up at the house the next evening, unannounced, and knocked on the door like nothing had happened. When I opened the door, she was standing on the porch with a small suitcase, her expression a mix of regret and desperation. "Erick, can we talk?" she asked. "I just need a few minutes." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me to keep the kids from overhearing. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked, my tone cold. "I miss my family," she said. "I miss you. I made a mistake, Erick. A horrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I want to fix this. I want to come home." "You can't just come back and pretend like nothing happened," I said. "You made your choice, Jessica. You don't get to undo it because things didn't work out with David." Her eyes widened in shock. "It's not about him," she insisted. "I ended it, Erick. He doesn't matter. You and the kids are what matter to me." I shook my head, my anger bubbling to the surface. "If we mattered, you wouldn't have cheated in the first place. You wouldn't have lied to my face for months. You don't get to rewrite history just because you're feeling guilty now." Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't waver. "I'll always love you, Erick," she said, her voice breaking. "Even if you can't forgive me, I need you to know that." "Love isn't enough," I said. "Not anymore." Jessica stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When it became clear that I wasn't going to, she nodded and turned to leave. I watched as she walked down the driveway and got into her car, the weight of finality settling over me. When I went back inside, the kids were sitting on the couch, their expressions worried. "Who was that?" Luke asked. "Just someone I used to know," I said. It wasn't the full truth, but it was all I could manage in that moment. For now, it would have to be enough. Jessica didn't return to the house after that evening, but her presence lingered. Luke and Emma were old enough to sense that something wasn't right, and it wasn't long before they started asking harder questions. I couldn't dodge them forever, no matter how much I wanted to. "Dad, why isn't Mom staying here anymore?" Luke asked one night while we were doing the dishes. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a deeper worry. Emma was at the table, pretending to work on a puzzle, but I could tell she was listening closely. I set the plate down and wiped my hands, stalling for time. "Sometimes, adults have problems they need to work out," I said carefully. "Right now, your mom and I are trying to figure out what's best for everyone." "But is she coming back?" Emma piped up, turning to face me. "I miss her." "I know you do," I said. "And she misses you too. You'll still see her, I promise." It wasn't the full truth, but it was all I could give them at that moment. Their questions subsided for the time being, but I knew the topic would come up again. I would have to tell them eventually, but I wasn't ready yet. Jessica called me later that night, and against my better judgment, I answered. "I need to see the kids," she said without preamble. Her voice sounded tired, like she hadn't been sleeping. "They're my children, Erick. I can't just disappear from their lives." "I never said you couldn't see them," I replied, "but it's going to be on my terms." "What does that mean?" she asked, a sharp edge creeping into her tone. "It means supervised visits, at least for now," I said. "You can see them, but not here. I'll bring them to the park or somewhere neutral." Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "So I have to meet my own kids like some stranger?" "You brought this on yourself," I said firmly. "I'm doing what I think is best for them." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I just want to make things right, Erick. Then start by respecting my boundaries," I said. "We'll talk about visitation when I'm ready." Jessica agreed reluctantly, and we arranged for her to meet the kids at the local park that weekend. I didn't tell Luke and Emma much, just that we were going to see their mom. They were thrilled, which made the situation even harder for me. I didn't want to take their happiness away, but I couldn't ignore what Jessica had done. When we arrived at the park, Jessica was already there, sitting on a bench near the playground. She stood up when she saw us, her face lighting up as Luke and Emma ran to her. They hugged her tightly, their laughter filling the air. I stayed back, giving them space but keeping a watchful eye. Jessica was good with the kids. I had to admit that. She listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and even helped Emma build a sandcastle. For a moment, it was almost like old times. But then she glanced in my direction, and the tension between us came rushing back. After an hour, I told the kids it was time to go. They protested, but I stood firm. Jessica didn't argue, though I could see the sadness in her eyes as she hugged them goodbye. As we walked back to the car, Luke looked up at me. "Why can't Mom come home?" he asked. "It's complicated," I said again. "But we'll figure it out, okay?" He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, work, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the kids. Jessica and I communicated mostly through text, coordinating visits and exchanging updates about Luke and Emma. She asked about coming to the house once, but I shut that down immediately. "I can't do this forever, Eric," she said during one of our calls. "I want to be part of their lives, not just a visitor." "You should have thought about that before," I said coldly. "This is the way it has to be for now." As much as I hated to admit it, part of me still cared about her. I didn't want to see her suffer, but I also couldn't forget what she had done. Every time I saw her, every time we spoke, the betrayal came rushing back. Rebecca called me one evening with news about the separation agreement. Jessica's lawyer had reviewed it and submitted some revisions. Nothing major, mostly small details about visitation and finances, but it was enough to remind me that this wasn't over yet. "She's not fighting for custody," Rebecca said. "That's a good sign. It means she knows she doesn't have much ground to stand on." "Yeah," I said, "but it doesn't make this any easier." "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But you're doing the right thing." Her words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't. Nothing about this felt right. I was trying to protect my kids, but at what cost? Luke and Emma missed their mom, and no matter how much I hated what she'd done, I couldn't deny that they needed her in their lives. The following weekend, Jessica had another visit with the kids. This time, we met at a coffee shop with a small play area in the back. The kids were excited to see her, and for the first time, I let myself relax a little. Maybe this could work, I thought. Maybe we could find a way to co-parent without destroying what was left of our family. But as I watched Jessica interact with them, laughing and smiling like nothing had changed, I felt a pang of resentment. She got to be the fun parent, swooping in for visits and making the kids happy, while I was the one left to pick up the pieces. It wasn't fair, but I couldn't let it show. When it was time to leave, Jessica pulled me aside. "Thank you for letting me see them," she said quietly. "It means a lot." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As we drove home, Luke and Emma chattered excitedly about their time with Jessica, completely unaware of the tension between us. I listened quietly, letting their voices fill the silence. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Bye-bye.